Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're keeping lovely and warm, and if you're living in a very cold part of the world and the temperature's exceedingly cold, let me know about it. Or if it's exceptionally hot, I'd also like to hear from you. So before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink, and whatever it is, I like to know about it, because I'm very fascinated by what everybody drinks. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, most of us may have a secret of some kind, or we did at some point in time. I most certainly do. For if I was to share this secret, it would end up causing hurt to the people I love, which is why I would never share it with anyone. Sometimes we need to keep a secret for the greater good, to protect those we love from being hurt, offended, or even disappointed, either in us or in someone they know. It may be something we did in the past that brings us a measure of shame, self-recrimination, or even disgust. Perhaps we may feel somewhat demeaned, embarrassed and humiliated by our own indiscretions, so we choose not to share them with others. Maybe it's a skeleton in the cupboard we keep from our children, for if they knew how out of control we were when we were their age, they might use our secret as a weapon against us. Well, Dad, I know you smoked weed when you were young. Why can't I? It might be an undisclosed secret that is so unfathomable, inexplicable and inscrutable that if you were to share it with someone, they might think you were completely deranged or off your head. So it's in your best interest to reveal nothing to them, to keep your mouth tightly and firmly shut. The latter was the reason my grandfather sat on his secret for over 50 years, a secret that he chose to share with me one bright spring morning, an ordinary day that turned out to be extraordinary, with his outlandish revelation. I remember at the time thinking, could this actually be true? There's no way this is true. But as my grandfather told me the story, his eyes clouded up with tears, his square jawline clenched, I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this tragic, profound, esoteric story was indeed true. It was a personal story I was to tell my grandfather that enabled him to tell me his story. So sometimes when we share a secret all of our own, another secret that we may not have been privy to hearing may be manifested to us out of the blue, like a crab suddenly crawling out of its seashell. This was certainly the case with my grandfather's secret. Ironically, he told me this remarkable story on a day when the innocence of the new morning had just begun. It was a beautiful sunny day. The soft shafts of sunlight twinkled through the kitchen, casting their gentle shadows onto the flagstone floor. It would seem that as spring had made her presence known, the colder days had been hijacked by a change of season. Ostensibly, my grandfather's two Great Danes, Molly and Pluto, gobbled up this gorgeous sunlight with a thankful gratefulness as they strategically positioned their long bodies on the floor. Their short grey coats could absorb every drop of this sunshine with a ravenous appreciation. It had been a cold, hard winter, most especially the month of January, when keeping warm in the large farmhouse had almost been impossible to accomplish, as the large, open-plan, spacious rooms were never easy to heat. So me and my grandfather, along with the domesticated animal congregation in the house, had effortlessly gravitated towards the library. It was a small room, but generous, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with quality hard books, some that are long since out of print, but made excellent reading material. The library was a resplendent, sumptuous, cosy room, painted in a deep vintage red colour, with a gleaming oakwood floor, a huge, magnificent Persian rug done in rich sequences of red and blues, a scattering of the most comfortable, durable white linen settees you've ever seen in your life, along with a very ornate, grandiose marble fireplace where my Gramps would light up the most sensational fires that would crackle away happily in the hearth, warming up the entire room so generously. It was hardly surprising that we loved that library so much, as nipping off to the other rooms in the house was rather like leaving behind the warmth of Hawaii and venturing boldly into sub-zero Arctic conditions, like the intrepid explorer, into the rest of the house, By all accounts, you could be forgiven for expecting to see a polar bear loitering around one of the other bedrooms, as that was how freezing cold the other rooms in my grandfather's house were. In a nutshell, it was hardly a surprise that in the library every member of our household, which included the two big fat tabby cats that had grown substantially oversized, not only from their regular feed, but by dining out on half the rat population in the outside barn, which they stealthily hunted during the twilight hours. The vet had looked at my grandfather disapprovingly when seeing the size of those cats' girths at their last appointment. "I don't know what it is about American cat owners," he said dismissively, giving my Gramps a steely, rather judgmental look, "but we allow our cats' waistlines to get out of control. I regret to have to tell you this, Mr. Pennington, but both Oscar and Morris here are morbidly obese." He said that in such a solemn voice, as if he was telling my Gramps that his cats had a rampant form of cancer or only days left to live. "I assure you, Doc," my grandfather had told him, "my cats are on a reduced-calorie kibble diet, but they are feasting on the rats in my barn. That is what is making them very fat." I don't think the vet believed my Gramps, but it was definitely true, every word of it, without exaggeration. Needless to say, it was clear the vet did not believe a word of it. "Well, cut down on giving your cats treats, Mr. Pennington," he told my grandfather. "You need to be cruel to be kind. All too often cat owners give their cats a little sliver of chicken here, a piece of ham there, and it all adds up, and the calories get ludicrously out of control." You're probably wondering why I was staying on my Gramps' farm alone. You would be right to ask that enigmatic question. I had moved into my grandfather's farmhouse, where I was to live with him exclusively for an entire year. A privilege and an honour that I delighted in, for my grandfather was my very best friend. We had always had a great connection. My grandmother, along with her best friend Nancy, my mother and father, were all going on a round-the-world trip for an entire year, on an exotic cruise liner. So while our family was out painting the world red, popping champagne on the equator, my Gramps and I were spending quality time together. My Gramps had no desire to globetrot. He wanted to man the fort, looking after the farmhouse he loved so much. I was being homeschooled at the farm, as I was 12 years old at the time. Suffice to say, my grandfather had lived on this farm all of his life, had grown up here himself as a young boy. It held for him so many wonderful nostalgic memories. I loved my Gramps' Colorado farmhouse, where he was involved in specialty ostrich farming, a whole new adventure that had been going remarkably well, as ostriches were easy to manage. Over recent years, thanks to people's increased and rising desire to improve their diets, there has been a huge interest in the lean, healthy meat an ostrich provides. But my Gramps also raises them for their feathers and their hide. Ostriches consume resources at a ratio far more profitable than cattle, so raising them was a no-brainer for my Gramps. But those birds can run for long distances, have a hell of a nasty kick, and drink a ton of water. My grandfather's farmhouse was an old colonial farmhouse with 2 stories and a wraparound porch, but all the rooms in the house were airy and big. The farmhouse was nestled in the middle of a valley, with a backdrop of undulating, billowing mountains that rose up under the cobalt blue sky like huge curvaceous giants, melting into this blue backdrop in swirling, sweeping folds of misty purple and blue vapour, so they looked hazy and obscure in the distance, but very dramatic and impressive for the eye to behold. Now that it was early spring, after the recent heavy rains, the farm looked like a sumptuous green park, while the silvery lake twinkled and gleamed in the noonday sun, and was heavily stocked with fish, flanked by large weeping willows with long feather-veined leaves that dangled above the water like viridescent feather boas. It was here that me and my Gramps did a lot of fishing together, a pastime that brought us a great deal of pleasure. There were a couple of cottages on the property that were sometimes rented out by people who were desirous to do a spot of fishing for themselves, and of course enjoy an extended break. You could describe my Gramps' property as botanical gardens with trees scattered liberally throughout the countryside, meadows that were fenced in for tall ostriches that ran across them with 2-toed legs. My favourite spot on my Gramps' land was a sprawling oasis or woodgrove, if you like, consisting primarily of tall statuesque bristle-toe pines, Douglas firs, Colorado blue spruces, mountain junipers, and narrow-leaf cottonwoods. It was a mixed wooded grove of varied tree species with precipitous mountain trails, rocky outcrops, a little stream that zigzagged through the woodgrove, thundering over the rocks with fast-flowing water. A spectacular haven, shall we say, for all kinds of indigenous wildlife, from foxes to mountain lions, elk, bighorn, sheep, bison, moose, and of course black bears. It was one night in early spring when I woke up in my grandfather's house to hear a strange roaring sound, a little like a lion, but a low pitch and frequency. I don't know why, but on this particular occasion it certainly aroused my attention. I wanted to find out exactly what it was, especially when I heard it again, as the noise was so bizarre. It was also in close proximity to our farmhouse. I guess you could say my ears perked up, rather like a dog's do. I could even hear the two Great Danes that slept in my Gramps' room let out a low growl. They had also heard the anomalous sound. I was naturally inquisitive by nature, not restrained by fear or bound by concerns over my own personal safety. At 12 years old, I didn't give those considerations a fleeting thought. I decided that the sounds, being an enigmatic oddity, warranted investigation, for if I didn't find out what the sound was, it would bother me indefinitely. I cautiously climbed out of the bed so as not to wake up my grandfather, although given his dogs had just growled, he might already be awake, I thought. Beyond the low growls of his dogs, I could luckily hear my grandfather's heavy snores. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Thankfully he hadn't woken up, for if he had, he might actively discourage me from going out of doors, something that adults are always inclined to do. I threw on a sweater and a pair of khaki pants, and of course sneakers, and I dashed down the staircase through to the kitchen. I grabbed a torch and made my way out of the back door, closing it behind me, but leaving it unlocked. I ventured vigilantly out into the tenebrous night. It was pitch black outside. I could barely even see the hands in front of my face without my torchlight. It was so dark, in fact, that I was ever grateful for the light of the torch. Everything was steeped in a velvety black darkness. The thin crescent moon seemed to cast faint shadows over the landscape, and as for the twinkling stars, they seemed dim by a slight mist. I suddenly heard the screaming sound again. I realized it was coming from the ostrich enclosure. I do know that male ostriches make a booming sound. Maybe that was the strange roaring noise I'd heard. It was rather peculiar, as I noticed that the normal nightly sounds of the crickets and frogs seemed absent, which was highly unusual, as I'd never known them not to entertain the night with their usual animated, jubilant song. Ostensibly, apart from the strange sound I had heard, everything was inauspiciously quiet. I moved cautiously towards a field of ostriches. I could see they were gathered together in a large, tight flock. They seemed fixated by something, their eyes pinned on a crouched, shadowy silhouette that was in the middle of the field. It looked like something 4 foot off the ground, that appeared wide, darker than the night. The mystifying aberrant behaviour of the ostriches was very weird, incongruous and atypical for them. I'd never seen them so subdued, still and quiet, almost as if they were locked under some kind of peculiar, mesmerising trance. I crawled under the fence, darting from one tree to another. Finally, when I was close enough to the idiosyncratic figure in the field that beheld the ostrich's unmitigated attention, I spontaneously, in my heightened perplexity, cast the light of my torch on the figure. Then it stood up, proud and tall, turning around to look directly at me, its deep-set eyes giving off a red, menacing eyeshine. Whatever it was, it didn't like the light of my torch. For a moment my eyes were a little out of focus, trying to adjust to the light to see what it was. I gasped in horror as I realized that the creature standing up, with loose ostrich feathers in one hand and a deceased ostrich torso in another, was a Bigfoot. I think he'd been sitting in the middle of the field, plucking the ostrich feathers out of the torso. Possibly the strange noise was from the ostrich he had recently killed. I couldn't be sure about that. Until this moment in time, I hasten to say that I'd never ever perceived that Bigfoots were real. The creature scrunched up his eyes due to my torchlight, waving my light away from him, as if to say, "Stop shining your torch in my eyes. It's bothering me." The creature, standing up on 2 feet, was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds. His hair was darker than the night, long and full. The creature looked at me, pulling back his thin lips, letting out the most terrifying roar that was very definitely personal. It was directed at me. He didn't want me ogling him in any way, like I was now. For a moment I didn't move, barely flinched even. Much like the ostriches, I seemed locked in a trance-like state. I found myself unable to react. I was frozen to the spot like a big, gormless, ineffacious lump of ice. It was only when the creature roared again that I jumped out of my skin and reacted, springing into action, where I began to hightail it back to the farmhouse, my adrenaline pumping through my veins speedily, my heart thundering in my ears. I was puffing, panting, and gasping for breath. I could hear the Bigfoot pounding the ground behind me, almost as if he was chasing me. I was certain he was. His feet, when they hit the ground, were ponderous and heavy. I could hear his breathing, which sounded exactly like a horse. It felt as if he was a hair's breadth behind me, but when I turned around, he was thankfully gone. I think he just wanted to scare me off. All I know is that I raced into the kitchen, locked the door behind me, literally falling to the floor in an exhausted, deflated heap, while I tried to gather my composure, which seemed to have abandoned me. In my heightened state of shock, I was shaking like a jello, seemingly so impotent and powerless to gain any sense of calm perspective. My grandfather's 2 Great Danes were at the kitchen door, growling fiercely. They must have sensed or even smelt the Bigfoot. The next morning when I came down for breakfast, I could smell bacon permeating the kitchen, with its mouth-watering smoky aroma, as my Gramps was frying eggs and bacon over the range. I was hungry, that was for sure. "That smells yummy, Gramps," I said, wondering whether I should tell him about the previous night. Would he believe me if I told him I'd encountered a Bigfoot? I was sure he wouldn't. "Good," said my bemused Gramps, looking somewhat distracted and preoccupied, as if his thoughts were 100 miles away. "What's wrong, Gramps? You look slightly flustered and bewildered this morning." "Maybe it's because I am. I think bewildered is a very good word to use in the circumstances. Something has neatly plucked out the ostrich feathers of one of my birds. It would seem my injured ostrich, the one with the very bad limp, well, he was killed last night, but by what I cannot imagine. That's my big conundrum this morning. To all intensive purposes, the only creature possible of plucking ostrich feathers out of a bird this neatly has to be a man. Weirder still, the 2 long legs, the neck and beak, are lying neatly together along with the feathers. Now, if a wild cat had attacked that ostrich, it wouldn't leave the feathers, neck and legs in such a neat pile. Not possible. It couldn't do it. On the contrary, there would be feathers scattered everywhere. It is an enigmatic situation, to say the least." I flushed red, knowing that I had the answers to his enigmatic question, but I was reluctant to be forthcoming. Finally I piped, "Gramps, do you believe in Bigfoot?" My grandfather did not answer me. His brown eyes, that had been pinned on me for a moment, quickly darted away, as if he didn't want me to see his expression. I knew then, in that instant, that he had seen a Bigfoot before, so I immediately relaxed. "Well, Gramps, last night I heard a strange roaring sound like a lion, so I ventured out into the field. It was very dark out there, but I knew the screaming sound was coming from the ostrich enclosure. All the ostriches were behaving very strangely, as if they were under some kind of hypnotism or trance. They were gathered together in a large cluster, watching a large male Bigfoot plucking out the feathers from one of the birds. I shone the torch on him, which he did not like. He kept waving it away from me, crinkling up his eyes as if the light of my torch was hurting him, making him squint. He then roared at me aggressively. He chased me away from the enclosure. He scared the living daylights out of me, Gramps. I was terrified." "Well, he got rid of our injured ostrich for us, which isn't a bad thing. It was in terrible pain. I was in 2 minds about what to do with him. I was considering putting him out of his misery myself. His suffering has been immense, poor bird. Even the antibiotics prescribed by my vet were useless. I imagine the Bigfoot saw her. He saw she was injured, thought it would be a tasty meal." "You believe me, Gramps," I said, astounded. "About the Bigfoot, I mean." "Oh, I believe you," said my Gramps. "Now you sit down. I will tell you a secret. I've never told anyone. It's a secret concerning a female Bigfoot, and it's a true story. But as other members of our family are out on a luxury cruise liner together, I will tell you a secret that I have never shared with anyone before." My heart began to flutter with excitement. "Does Granny know about this secret?" "Of course she doesn't, son. For if she did know, then it wouldn't be a secret, would it? This is a secret that I've only ever shared with you. Well, I'm about to anyway." This was the story my Gramps told me. "Growing up on this farm, I had one older sister called Meredith, and of course a younger brother called Keith." "A brother," I said. "That's news to me. I didn't know you had a brother." "Well, you wouldn't have known him," said my Gramps regretfully. "He passed away long before you were born, when he was 18. He was a good-looking boy, like you, tall and lanky, with a full head of blonde hair, cornflower blue eyes. Growing up, all the young girls had their eyes on him. Can't blame them, really. He was a looker. It's not a subject that I care to discuss. It brings up all kinds of wistful, nostalgic and painful memories for me that I don't like to dwell on, as you can never fix what is broken, can you? Or go back in time to undo all the damage. For if you could, I would be there in a heartbeat. In fact, it was my brother's fortuitous death that made my parents move to the town and hand over the reins of this farm to me, so that I could manage everything on their behalf, which obviously I did. My parents were far too devastated about my brother's inexpedient, inopportune death to stay here on the farm. It quite literally knocked the stuffing out of them, as you can fully appreciate. So I took over at a very young, tender age, and went from cattle ranching to ostrich farming more recently. Quite a transition, even if I say so myself." "But that's so sad, Gramps. You never mentioned your brother to me before. Were you very close?" "Yes, we were very close. Well, it's a subject the family never likes to talk about. It breaks open a lot of sorrowful wounds, naturally. Keith was a wonderful younger brother. He rarely was. Only a couple of years younger than myself. Growing up, we would have so much fun together, the two of us. Sometimes we would help my grandfather with his cattle herd. Other times we would fish at the lake together, catch bass or catfish, which my mother would fillet superbly and pan-fry in butter, lemon, parsley and garlic. It would melt in the mouth like butter. It was so tender. Our favourite thing Keith and I enjoyed the most was to play cowboys and Indians together in the wood grove. Keith liked to be an Indian chief. He had an Indian headdress made out of eagle's feathers, whereas I had a cowboy hat. One day, me and my brother were riding our bikes down one of the precipitous trails in the wood grove. Then we propped our bicycles up against a couple of juniper trees in order to play cowboys and Indians. Keith was wearing his headdress, while I was wearing my black cowboy hat. Not much has changed, as you can see. My sister Meredith was at home helping my mother make strawberry jams and packets of vanilla fudge to sell at the school fete the following weekend. At first, the forest was so congenial, so we played in this vibrant, all-embracing atmosphere. We could hear the happy chirrups, tweets, twitters and warbles of the birds. But then it became incredibly quiet and inauspicious. Indeed, it was so quiet and bodeful you could literally hear a pin drop. It was a very unnerving experience for us. The silence itself was disturbing. Granted, we could hear the water thundering over the rocks from the stream, but beyond that, everything was oppressively still. I remember getting this incongruous, irrational, baleful, rather threatening feeling that something was hiding in the dark shadows and watching us. I glanced up at my brother. His face had drained so white. He exclaimed that he'd seen a large black face staring at him from behind a tree. "You think it was a bear?" I asked him. He said, "No, it wasn't a bear. It was something hairy with a human face. It was looking at me. I know it was." I asked him to show me where he'd seen the face, but when I went to the tree in question, nothing was there. I was sure my brother had made up the image in his mind. Due to the dancing ethereal light in the wood grove, that much like the fluffy clouds up in the sky, can certainly make you believe you saw something when you really did not. The shadows in the dark forest can be exceedingly misleading, deceptive, and even ghostly. But all they are is shadows, nothing more or nothing less. That is what I assumed he'd seen, of course. But there was something there, he insisted. I know what I saw. Please let's get out of here now, before something terrible happens. There was no doubt that the forest felt objectionably inauspicious, so I reluctantly agreed to call a halt to our game. But when we went to retrieve our bicycles, they had simply vanished. Lo and behold, we discovered our bicycles perched high up on a tree, over 12 feet off the ground. I could hardly believe it. I ask you, how does a bicycle get parked high up in a tree like that? Somehow we managed to bring them down. But something or someone had put them there in the tree. But who? My brother said to me, I told you, that face wasn't in my imagination. It was that thing that was spying on us. Suffice to say, every time we would go to the resplendent, viridescent woodgrove with our bikes, we found them later balancing high up precariously in the trees, sometimes wheel side up, which was awfully strange. We couldn't fathom what was going on, but my brother kept insisting that he could see a black, hairy, human-like face staring at him with twinkling eyes from behind a tree trunk, every time we went out into the woods. But I never saw it. I thought he was making the whole thing up. But my brother was not inclined to make up fictitious stories, so I was between a rock and a hard place in wondering what it is that I should believe. I would challenge him tirelessly, exclaiming that his imagination was in overdrive. He was making up faces in his mind, but he insisted he was not. Why do we both feel we're being watched, he would exclaim. Do you suppose that's our quick-witted, inventive imaginations making all the stuff up? No, I think not. And then what about our bikes? Something keeps putting them up high in the tree. I told him that there had to be an alternative explanation for the peculiarity, that more than likely one of the farm employees was playing an expedient, misleading trick on us. But my brother was not convinced, as it happened every time, and he claimed that none of our farm hands had an ingenious sense of humour. My brother began to tell me that during the night in his bedroom, the same black face he saw in the woodgroves had been looking at him through his window at night. He would show me the smudges on his window pane the following morning. My brother never liked to draw his curtains, but he became increasingly rattled by the face that peered at him through the window almost every night. My mother would say, Sweetheart, you're just like me. You and I are a lot alike. I've got a fertile imagination. I have lucid dreams all the time. I see things sometimes that are not there. You must have inherited that from me. Then it happened, said my grandfather. What happened? I asked. Well, one night after my brother had gone to sleep, the following morning we woke up to find the kitchen door had been left wide open, that my brother was no longer in his bed. My brother was 18 at the time, so my mother was very annoyed with him. Where had he gone? Why had he just randomly left without a bye or leave? So Keith got up early this morning, did he? She complained. Decided to leave the door wide open, did he? I woke up this morning to find half the chicken coop pecking around our kitchen. He knows better than to leave the door wide open like this. Even worse, he failed to make his bed this morning before he left, which is most unlike him. What on earth is going on with the boy? As the weekend faded away, my mother became more and more indignant. She had heard that several people in Keith's form at school had gone camping. One of the mothers was convinced she had seen Keith among the boys, but she'd probably seen Dylan, as they were very alike, both those boys. My mother assumed Keith had gone off with them, failing to tell them where he was going, and she was more than a little peeved off. Your brother should know better than to go camping without informing me. I didn't raise him to be so disrespectful, but of late he's been behaving atrociously. He should know better than to go swanning off like this, without telling me where he's going. If I didn't know where he was right now, I would be beside myself with worry. Thanks to Mrs. Mayer, I can actually sleep tonight, but no thanks to your brother. It was on Sunday night that Keith came running into my bedroom at 12 o'clock at night. The whole house was fast asleep, steeped in silence. He was shaking me violently. Simon, get up! Simon, get up! I groaned in annoyance, pulling the sheets over my head, but my brother persisted in shaking me. You're back already, I said in surprise. Mum and Dad aren't expecting you back yet until Monday night. Mum is jumping through hoops, she's so angry with you. She's incensed that you never told her about the camping trip. It was Mrs. Myers who told her where you were. She was almost having a coronary. Why are you back so early?" "What are you talking about?" said Keith. "I never went camping." I sat up with a start. "Well then, where the hell have you been? Mum nearly had a cadenza when you left the kitchen door wide open, inviting the entire hen population to poop all over her immaculate flagstone floor. She got really peeved that you failed to make your bed after you got up. So if you didn't go camping, then where have you been?" "It's all very weird," said Keith, looking at me with a stern expression on his face. "You know the black face that I kept seeing at the window? That I rarely kept telling you all about? That's been looking at me through the window pane, night after night? That I always used to see in the woodgrove?" "The one in your imagination," I said sarcastically. "Well, what about it?" "I'm not making this up, bro. One minute I was there in my bedroom, looking at her, staring at me through the window, which she does every single night. The next thing I knew was I'd walked outside the house, through the back kitchen door. It was like I went straight out to meet her, in a hypnotic, trance-like state. When I came out of my stunned stupor, the creature had thrown me over her back. She was carrying me up this rocky elevation, quite a long way away from here actually, but she moved so fast like the wind. Then I was in a sumptuous cave, which was surprisingly cosy. It had been swept clean, was generously lined with animal pelts, so that the floor was like a fabulous carpet. There were large woven baskets full of fruits there. I was lying on the straw bed covered with animal pelts. She was offering me berries to eat, some strange-looking roots and raw meat that looked rather like rabbit. A while later, a big male humanoid ape-like creature came into the cave. He was astonished to see me in there. He stared at me in bewilderment with an agog expression. Then he began arguing with the female, pointing at me. She was screaming at him indignantly, stamping her foot like a petulant, spoilt brat, determined to get her way. Then sometimes she would shriek at him like a belligerent teenager, reacting adversely, in the duplicitous, guileful hope that a manipulative tantrum will make her parent concede. It was that kind of outrageous behaviour that she was exhibiting. The creatures were speaking the strange language together, with audible syllables backwards and forwards, but they spoke terribly fast. I knew I was the subject of a great argument. I was sensing the female was telling the big male she wanted to keep me as her mate. I distinctly got that impression. He was telling her that she certainly could not. I remember he spoke with a deep, smooth voice that was very authoritative, very determined. He kept giving me sideways, empathetic glances. His eyes were terribly kind, very intelligent. I got the distinct impression that his daughter, the one seemingly fixated by me, was always getting up to lots of mischief. I heard him saying in my mind, "Don't you worry. I'll get you back to safely when her back is turned away from you." The female would come up to me dotingly. She'd stroke my hair like a dog. It was exceedingly annoying. She kept bringing me food and gazing into my eyes adoringly, like a love-struck teenager. I could sense from her energy that she truly fancied me. "Are you winding me up? Is this all some kind of a crazy joke?" I asked my brother. "No, I'm being serious, bro. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. And regardless what Mum says, I don't actually have a good imagination. All those times we were in the woodgrove together, don't you remember? And I kept telling you about the black face I was seeing. She was showing her face to me, not to you. That was intentional on her part. She wanted me to be the one to see her. She had a crush on me for a long time, I think. She was the one putting our bicycles high up in the tree. And I think she was the one that stole Mum's missing fudge." "So what is she then?" I asked. "Well, she's human, isn't she? But she has ape-like influences to her appearance. But the creatures, whatever they are, appear to be big, powerful, muscular, intelligent, and they seem to have superpowers. I think they're some kind of primitive human being, although they do seem to have some extraordinary abilities. That female Bigfoot hypnotized me. She enabled me to leave my bedroom that night. I still don't know how she did it. It was like I was completely mesmerized under her spell." "So how did you get away from the cave?" I asked. "Well, the moment the female got distracted, the male grabbed me. He quickly threw me over his shoulders, brought me right back here. I tell you, bro, he was ever so nice to me, such a gentleman. He even apologized to me in my mind. He said he was sorry for what had happened, to accept his profusive apologies on behalf of his people, that his daughter is slightly off-centre, whatever that is supposed to mean. Are you sure he spoke to you in your mind? I asked. Absolutely certain. I'm in no doubt about it. You couldn't have made the words up in your head yourself, I suggested. No, I definitely didn't. I could hear another voice in my head, distinctly different to my own, just like I hear you speaking now. It wasn't my voice. You are right, then. They must have rare qualities. You mustn't tell the parents what happened to me. Promise me you won't, bro. They'd never believe me anyway. Your secret's safe with me, bro. I hardly want to tell Mum you were abducted by a female ape-like humanoid. She'd think I'd lost leave of my senses, would she not? The next morning when my mother saw my brother had returned, she jumped down his throat. You're back, are you, Keith? Now isn't that very nice, she said, putting her hands on her hips and glaring at my brother defiantly. You thought you could go swanning off on a camping adventure, did you? How very nice for you, without even telling us where you were going. What do you have to say for yourself, young man? I hope you're proud of yourself. To say that I'm grievously disappointed in your insubordinate behaviour is an understatement. I didn't raise you to be so thoughtlessly inconsiderate. He's 18, said my father, leaping to Keith's defence. Don't be so hard on him. He's allowed to be a little bit more independent, surely. He's old enough. He's 18, but while he's living under our roof, he abides by our rules. I'm sorry, Mum, said Keith. I really didn't mean to be so thoughtless. There, sweetheart, said my father. He's given you an apology. Are you happy now? I'm still mad as a hatter, said my mother. When you went out, Keith, in the middle of the night like a ghost, you failed to close the door behind you. My kitchen was inundated with our feathery friends. There was poop scattered everywhere. And if that wasn't bad enough, you never even bothered to make your bed. Sweetheart, said my father, you're coming down on Keith way too hard. He told you he was sorry. Whose side are you on, Philip? You're supposed to be my husband. We discipline our children together. I keep telling you, sweetheart, Keith is not a child anymore. He's 18. You're talking to him as if he's a 2-year-old. He's grown up now. He's not a baby. Well, that's because he's behaving like he's 2, said my mother. I'm sorry, Mum. I'll make it up to you, Keith assured her. That night when we went to bed, I happened to sleep in the bedroom that was closest to the staircase, so I pretty much heard everything that went on downstairs. I could hear someone lumbering around as if they were walking in an uncoordinated way. At first I didn't pay any attention to the noise. I thought someone in a groggy, sleepy state had gone to the kitchen to get a glass of milk. I woke up with a start as I remember Keith had told me that the female Bigfoot had put him under a trance. He slept in the downstairs bedroom. I wondered if she had returned again to perform the same stunt on him and had somehow managed to hypnotize him. I dashed down the sweeping staircase to the kitchen. The door had been left wide open. Icy blasts of cold air were blowing through the opening of the door. That was when I saw the female Bigfoot with my brother. Of course, back then I didn't know she was a Bigfoot. It was in that revelatory moment that I realized my brother's stories about these humanoid apes had to be true. This creature was real. She was tall and huge with long flowing black hair, a pyramid-shaped head, and small pert breasts. She looked to be relatively young. All I know is that she was behaving like an irate woman. She began kicking furiously at my brother with her tree-trunk-sized legs that packed a powerful punch, seemingly oblivious to her own strength. My brother seemed to snap out of his hypnotic state. He was trying desperately to fight back, but it happened all too fast for even me to react. 1 minute the Bigfoot was kicking my brother. The next thing he was down on the ground, lying motionless. The Bigfoot tried to wake him up, but he lay there limp and unresponsive. She then let out a god-awful scream and glided away. My parents, on hearing the fitful scream, dashed down the staircase as quickly as they could in their pyjamas. My mother dashed over to Keith. She began to shake him violently to try and wake him up. But he was dead. They asked me what had happened, but I told them I'd heard a scream and found Keith like that. I could never tell them about the ape-like humanoid, for even if they did believe me, it would have distressed them too much. And besides, it would sound far-fetched and fanciful. So I didn't tell them what happened. But the coroner said he had a massive internal bleeding from a ruptured aorta, so he died very quickly. She said that my brother had been beaten with a powerful force. They concluded it must have been a bear attack, but my mother couldn't understand why my brother was lying dead on our front yard late at night. But my father suggested he went out to investigate a noise he must have heard, and probably encountered an angry bear. Wow, Gramps, that's an incredible story. I can't believe she actually killed your brother. Do you think she did so because if she couldn't have him, then she didn't want anyone else to have him? Well, it's a distinct possibility, isn't it? Said my grandfather. But then after she did kick him, she did appear to show some remorse. When she discovered he was dead, she let out a terrible scream. I think she was rather distressed about what she'd done. Perhaps she didn't know her own strength. Who knows what was going through her head? She was obviously furious he'd got away. That was obviously clear. Why are you telling me your secret? I asked my Gramps. I feel so privileged to hear it. Well, because you and I are here in this farmhouse for a whole year. It's a special time that we have together, is it not? While the rest of the family are sauntering around the globe. And you witnessed a Bigfoot yourself last night. And besides, when I go down to the grave, I think I would like someone to know my secret, especially my favourite grandson, like you. Needless to say, we never saw another Bigfoot again, but my Gramps is convinced they're still out there, but they remain elusively in the shadows. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.